Hello and welcome to the European Dialogue, a podcast brought to you by the EU Values Jean Monnet Network, where we examine the most pressing global issues with leading experts to explore the forces shaping our world today. I'm Emily Jones and I'm delighted to have you with us. In this episode, we're pleased to learn from Dr. Berk Esen, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sabancı University in Turkey. Berk is a leading scholar on party politics, democratic backsliding, and authoritarian regimes, with research spanning Turkey, the Middle East, and Latin America. In this episode, we will dive into some pressing questions: how European values are perceived from a Turkish perspective, the similarities and differences in democratic erosion between Turkey and the US, and what lessons Europe might draw from its engagement with countries like Turkey, Hungary, and Serbia. From the rapid political shifts in Turkey to trends shaping democracies around the world, Berk brings both strong scholarship and first-hand insight into the forces at play. So stay tuned and be sure to check out the podcast description for all the links and information in this podcast. So a big welcome to the podcast, Berk. Let's dive right in. How would you assess European values from a Turkish point of view?
Well, it depends on how you define European values because, as you know, historically speaking, there has not necessarily been a single European polity, and there have been, over the decades, in fact, centuries, major political and cultural differences between different parts of Europe. Eastern Europe, or Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe have had their major differences. But I think since the time of the Enlightenment, European values in the context of Ottoman Empire and then Turkey have been associated with enlightenment, modernity, rationalism, and secularism. So in that sense, from a Turkish perspective, European values have long been touted as a model to aspire to. And those values were used by Ottoman statesmen starting from late 18th century onwards in order to modernize and reform the Ottoman polity. And I think that tradition continued well into the Turkish Republic. So, modernizing the Ottoman state and then pushing for a secular polity to come into place. And that secularization have also engulfed the judicial system and the education system have become rather very popular. So popular, in fact, that the successive Turkish governments, going all the way back to 1959, have tried to become part of the European integration process. Right? Turkey first applied for membership to the European Economic Community in 1959. And it has generated decades-long process of, on the one hand, Europeanization in the Turkish context. On the other hand, Turkish governments trying to persuade their European counterparts to join that polity. But unfortunately, it has not really worked out in the end. And I think that has created frustration and disappointment, probably on both sides, but particularly on the Turkish side. So European values at this point in 21st century, I would associate with human rights, enlightenment, democratization. The irony is, going all the way back to 1990s and 2000, there seems to be a discrepancy between the Turkish aspirations of joining the European Union versus the Turkish practice when it comes to these political issues. And that is a problem that still continues as Turkish politics has become very authoritarian over the past decade. But at the same time, I think one needs to also mention the double standards and the hypocrisy when it comes to the European polity. So EU member states that have not necessarily welcomed Turkey with open arms, various European right-wing actors that have objected to Turkish membership because of the Muslim majority status of the Turkish society. I think the persistent blockade over Cyprus and the shift towards transactionalism over the migration question. So that's why European values, from a Turkish perspective, in the year 2025, really bring us a very complicated picture.
Indeed, very complicated. These double standards you mentioned, they're also something we touched on during an interview kind of earlier in this series with Meltem Muftulabac from Sabancı University during our episode together. And for listeners, I would really recommend that episode as well as this one. So talking of authoritarianism and perhaps taking a step away from Europe for a second to focus on the US, which is obviously making big waves right now and in many areas of its own foreign policy and others. Do you see any notable differences or similarities in how political leadership and institutions have evolved in both countries, that is in the US and in Turkey, especially regarding the treatment of opposition and the use of state power?
I think definitely these two cases reflect a broader global wave of autocratization. Since 2007, more countries around the globe have experienced democratic erosion and autocratization than those countries that have witnessed democratization. And currently, unfortunately, after nearly 16 or 17 years of this autocratization process at the global stage, we have more countries that are authoritarian than democratic in the world. And that is a really pessimistic sight to see. So majority of the world population, unfortunately, lives under authoritarian regimes. So it's not just because of Turkey and US, but obviously a number of very populous countries, most prominent being India, have transitioned to electoral autocracies. And I think that represents a very somber reality. When it comes to Turkey and US, I think they're undergoing a very similar process of democratic erosion and autocratization. What distinguishes this current autocratization wave from previous episodes of democratic breakdown is that currently democratic regimes erode gradually as opposed to overnight. And democracies, when they do collapse, they do so not because of a military coup or a revolution or some kind of an executive takeover, but rather in a piecemeal fashion through the actions of popularly elected leaders. So basically, leaders who are democratically elected use democratic instruments in order to undermine and eventually eliminate these democratic channels. And I think both Turkey and US are great examples of that, because both cases represent right-wing populist autocratic figures who have come to power, having polarized the society. And upon coming to power, they sought to capture the bureaucracy and the judiciary, amassed more powers at the executive branch. And then once they have completed that process, they've begun to use their newly acquired powers in order to systematically target their critics, their opponents, and weaken mainstream opposition politicians. And insofar as they have succeeded in polarizing the society, they get away with these autocratic steps. So in that sense, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's current president, is probably one of the trendsetters of this autocratization wave, because his party came to power in November 2002. And under his watch, Turkish politics experienced democratic erosion going all the way back to 2007 or 2008. So he's one of the first cases of this autocratization wave. Of course, many other countries have joined since then. Trump is rather one of the more recent examples. But what I find to be rather interesting is that the US case, even though it's a latecomer to this autocratization wave, it has accelerated that process. That, the sort of things that took nearly 20 years to take place in the Turkish context is occurring during the second Trump presidency within the course of just a few months. For instance, attacks on media, takeover of universities, open investigations against liberal groups, particularly those at college campuses. So I think there we have clear similarities in terms of a nationalist rhetoric, media manipulation, disinformation campaigns, gradual institutional decay and erosion of democratic institutions, and weakening of intra-party dissent, right? Dissent against Erdogan, dissent against Trump has been severely punished within their respective parties. I think there you have very clear similarities. Having said that, very briefly, I should also point out some differences between these two cases, because obviously US, even to this day, is a well-established liberal democracy. Now, Turkey has never achieved that status, right? Turkey, even in its best day, was a defective democracy. So in that sense, the decline and the eventual breakdown of the democratic regime in Turkey was an outcome that is more easily produced than what you may have in US, where you still have fairly strong institutions, the judiciary is still somewhat intact, media is still there, civil society is still somewhat strong. So I am hopeful that US will not get to a point where Turkey has already achieved. US, of course, has a federal system, which gives significant powers to individual state governments, some of which are controlled by the opposition party, Democrat Party, that can fight back. Whereas in the Turkish context, we do have local governments that are opposition controlled, but the power of the purse, their ability to resist against central government is a lot more limited. That, I think, is another major difference. President Erdogan and his party comes from a very far-right conservative Islamist background, whereas Trump captured what was, until recently, a centrist right-wing party, Republican Party. And it was under Trump's watch that the Republican Party shifted to almost a far-right position. So in that sense, I think there are some interesting differences as well.
Wow, that's terrifying. Oh, wow. I would love to share your optimism that the existing US institutions can protect further democratic erosion there. But then, yeah, like your observation, the US has declined in those things in just a few months what Turkey has taken 20 years to do. It's just so shocking.
Well, maybe one last point of addition is that, of course, Turkey is a middle power. And the breakdown of Turkish democracy has some regional repercussions, but I don't think this is going to affect global politics. But the potential breakdown of US democracy is going to have massive repercussions for the entire international system, the free trade regime, as well as obviously other democracies out there. And I think what Trump is doing, unlike Erdogan, whose policies tend to be grounded in the Turkish context, when Trump takes a decision, it has repercussions for other countries. That is not necessarily a difference per se, but I think it's something that we need to keep in mind.
Just terrifying, and we are seeing this every day. Are you hearing about this real-life experience from Turkish academics in the US that you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course, and it's quite interesting because especially some of these Turkish colleagues who were afraid of the Turkish context and did not want to reside here are now experiencing, in some ways, very similar developments, but they're not citizens. And there, the process, in a very paradoxical manner, hurts them even more because here, I get pressure. I may even lose my job, but I can survive. Whereas in the US context, if you lose your job, it's over. Even in a liberal democratic context, the pressure may be even more than what you have currently in Turkey.
Gosh, just awful. And well, all the more important that we are, of course, here this week and through the EU Values Network talking about this. So, considering Turkey's status as both a NATO member and an EU candidate country, how would you characterise Europe's approach to democratic governance in Turkey? To what extent do you think its engagement reflects broader strategic interests versus normative concerns?
I think here the answer depends on the time frame, because during the early post-Cold War era, so I'm referring to the 1990s and 2000s, both the European Union and the US promoted democratic reforms and civilian control over the military. Particularly the European Union enjoyed high leverage over Turkey because Turkey at the time wanted to join the European Union, and so European Union membership was used as a carrot by the EU Commission to compel successive Turkish governments to enact a number of substantial political reforms, which facilitated democratization in the Turkish context. So late 1990s and 2000s, because of this accession conditionality, in other words, Turkey trying to satisfy the political criteria of the Copenhagen criteria, the political conditions of the Copenhagen criteria, they had to enact a number of substantial democratization reforms. 2005 is the year when Turkey started accession talks with the European Union. Also happens to be the most democratic year in Turkey's entire political history. So in that sense, up until mid-2000s, I would say that both the US, but particularly the EU, had a very positive role in promoting democratization. Post-2005, particularly post-2010s, so the last, roughly speaking, 15 years, it's a completely different story, where increasingly geopolitical priorities have trumped democratic concerns, and EU member states were, especially right-wing governments in several EU member states, were on the one hand were not interested in really promoting that accession process, and so some governments began to veto the accession talks, and that slowed down that democratization process. But then gradually, EU, particularly in the aftermath of the Syrian migration crisis, so post-2015, started dealing with Turkey in a transactional manner. In other words, rather than try to promote democratization and facilitate normative changes within the Turkish polity in hopes of one day including Turkey within the European Union, the decision was already taken that Turkey will never become an EU member, and thus promoting normative change along democratization lines was no longer really an important political concern. And so many EU member states started to engage in a transactional manner with Turkey. So I give you this and you give me that. And I'm not going to deal with any other political issues. And obviously, migration was the big issue on the agenda. In exchange for Turkey agreeing to host millions of Syrian migrants, many EU member states, particularly Merkel's Germany, was willing to turn a blind eye to the autocratization process that engulfed Turkish politics all throughout 2010s, but particularly past or post 2015. So in that sense, EU had a very positive role up until mid-2000s, and since then, not so much. And lately, probably had a very negative role to play.
Right. Yeah, so helpful and protective of what democracy means until it isn't convenient, by the sounds of it. Interesting. But compared to other countries in the region, like Hungary or Serbia, how does Turkey's political direction compare to those?
I think there are several parallels among Turkey and these other cases within the European Union and in its neighborhood. So Hungary, until the most recent election, Poland, and certainly Serbia. These are all countries that are, except for Poland lately, of course, they were all countries that have been run by right-wing populist leaders who resemble one another, right? Vucic, Orban, Kaczynski, Erdogan. These are shrewd political operators who have risen through the ranks of their respective political parties. These are right-wing populist leaders who have figured out an effective way to mend and merge nationalist and religious appeals. So Serbian nationalism, which of course has a very strong Orthodox Christian element, Turkish nationalism, which has a very strong Sunni religious element, obviously the Polish, the Catholic nationalist combination, Hungary a bit more on the secular side, but again, they're a fusion of some, conservative values with nationalism. And using that strategy, these leaders have put together electoral majorities that enabled their parties to come to power and then win several re-elections. On the basis of the parliamentary majorities they have commanded, they ended up restructuring the electoral systems to their benefit, curtailed media and judicial independence, and suppressed and targeted dissent. First coming from the ruling parties and then from the opposition parties. So there are obviously some interesting national differences. What issues these leaders have used to mobilize electoral majorities differed from case to case. For instance, Orban has adopted a very anti-migrant discourse, and that has enabled him to win elections after 2014, when his support was on the wane. Whereas in the Turkish context, Erdogan has in fact adopted, you could say, a pro-migrant discourse, certainly juxtaposed to Orban, to make an appeal for Muslim solidarity, both within the country and in Turkey's nearby region. Nationalist appeals, anti-EU messages, Serbia and Turkey likewise. This notion that these countries were encircled, attacked, being sidelined by Europe. Whereas, of course, with regards to cases like Hungary and Poland, these are two countries that are already within the EU. Then this backlash against Eurocrats, Brussels, these very liberal cosmopolitan elites with their allies firmly located within the opposition parties. I see a lot of similarities in that sense. The timing differs a bit when it comes to the Turkish case, because, as I already pointed out, Erdogan's party came to power in late 2002, whereas, of course, Orban, Vučić, and Kaczynski have come at different points throughout the 2010s. So Erdogan is really the trendsetter. But when you look at Turkish politics, as I also briefly alluded to, democratic erosion began in late 2000s. So in that sense, we see a common shift, quite possibly for similar reasons. I think the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, the weakening of European economies, with European Union no longer being a very appealing example, these all played a role. Looking at the opposition, one could also see some interesting similarities. For a very long time in these countries, the reason why the opposition kept on losing elections was because they were divided, fragmented, partly because of the electoral system, partly because of the ruling parties maneuvering, and partly because of the existence of various political and ethnic and social cleavages. Lately, so last 5 to 6 years, we've seen in every single one of these countries, opposition parties coordinate with one another in order to establish electoral alliances that could help them defeat the autocratic incumbents. In Hungary and Turkey, these alliances did not work out at the national level, and the opposition parties lost the general elections, and so the leader went on to win re-election. But at the local level, the opposition won in Budapest, the opposition won in Istanbul, Ankara, various other major cities in Turkey. Of course, in Poland, this alliance really worked out in bringing about government turnover through the ballot box in the 2023 elections, whereas, of course, in Serbia, that change has been lacking. And the final note, I think it'll be interesting to look at the role that EU played in failing to overturn the democratic erosion processes in these countries. I think it's a more embarrassing example. Hungary would be a more embarrassing example, because it was a country that was recognized as a liberal democracy, has been a member of EU since 2004, and yet, while as an EU member state under Viktor Orban's rule, the democratic system eroded, and partly with the complicity of European actors, right? Various European right-wing actors, particularly the German, the CSU, but also some other right-wing parties ended up appeasing Viktor Orban for many years. Maybe not anymore, but until it was late. I think in Poland, you could still make a case that Europeanization played a role in bringing about the opposition's election victory. because unlike Hungary, I think you still have a pro-European electorate in Poland, a pro-European electorate which knows the dangers of Russia. So Polish nationalism is not necessarily an anti-European nationalism. And, in Donald Tusk, the Polish opposition found a very credible, somewhat charismatic politician who also enjoys very close links to European institutions. Whereas for Serbia and Turkey, likewise, I think anti-European sentiments played a strong role, but also in terms of migration management, I think EU has been complicit in supporting in supporting Erdogan, and probably even for Serbia, one could make a similar note. And very briefly, in terms of their foreign policy, there are also some broad similarities. These are all countries that promote a right-wing populist foreign policy. Which means that rather than following a very pro-Western course, they try to hedge their bets. They negotiate separately with Russia, China, and the West, trying to get better deals from each side. And so while an EU member state, Hungary, for instance, has attracted a lot of investment from China, has signed a deal with Russia to have a nuclear reactor financed by the Russian government, and likewise Turkey also deals with it. So a lot of broad similarities between these countries.
Very interesting observations. Yeah. On your point of the EU failing to protect democratic erosion, what tools do you think the EU still has to promote democratic governance in countries such as Turkey?
Well, unfortunately, over the past decade, EU's leverage has significantly diminished in the Turkish context because EU increasingly sees Turkey as a potential ally in areas of migration, security, and trade. I've already mentioned how the Turkish government was given a free hand to act as it pleased in domestic politics in exchange for hosting millions of Syrian migrants who otherwise were destined for European countries. In March 2016, EU and Turkey signed a migration protocol, which is no longer in effect, but at the time it was a big deal. And that year was really when Turkish democracy finally broke down. So I think it played a strong role, and that's why EU has limited leverage over Turkey. Now, since then, obviously, EU countries have become increasingly concerned with Russia's, with the Russian threat and Putin's expansionary goals. More recently, there is increasing conflict in Middle East. Turkey has emerged as a stable country, one that, even if it does not promote a very pro-Western foreign policy, could still deal with and interact with the European Union in its foreign policy, and especially after Trump got elected as U.S. president again, given his hostile attitude towards EU member states, I think Europeans increasingly look up to Erdogan as a potential partner who can manage things, and that has really given enormous autonomy and political advantages to Erdogan, who realizes that whatever he does, he's not going to really face significant criticism from his European counterparts. And indeed, exactly 100 days ago, the opposition mayor of Istanbul was arrested by the government on fictitious charges. It looks fabricated evidence. It looks, given everything that we've heard so far. And yet, European politicians, many European governments have been rather silent on this operation. Several European Union Commission officials have criticized this. Macron have had a few criticisms to express. SPD in Germany enjoys close links with the center-left political opposition in Turkey, and so they've been critical. A few mayors here and there in European cities have criticized the operation, but otherwise, overall, EU has been silent. In fact, Erdogan enjoys excellent relations with Viktor Orban and the Meloni government in Italy. The Labour Party government in UK, well, it's not part of EU, but I still consider UK to be part of Europe. Has been completely silent. So that I think says a lot and goes back to that shift to transactionalism. I think European politicians no longer have any expectations of democratization from Turkey, which is why this is no longer really part of their political demands from Turkey. Now, to a certain extent, I can understand, in this age of growing multipolarity, with Russia constituting a threat, with China being a potential threat, and US no longer being a reliable ally, it is a difficult world for European Union, and they need to proceed very carefully. That I understand, but I think they still need to be able to entertain some leverage over Erdogan, at the very least, to prevent Turkey from transitioning to a full autocracy. Now, Turkey is a country of 85 million people, right on the doorsteps of European Union. There are so many Turkish migrants living in Western European countries. Turkey is EU's reliable trade ally, potential partner. For such an important country to transition to a full autocracy, I think it's going to create all sorts of massive dangers in the long run that I think the short run advantages that EU can extract from Erdogan should not outweigh these long running risks. What tools does the EU have against these kind of cases? I think for the EU member states, EU has the power of the purse, right? EU member states can withhold EU structural funds from being dispensed to countries that violate the EU jurisdiction. And I think lately this is a powerful tool that has been used against Viktor Orban. And it's unfortunate that it has only recently been being used, but that certainly would have an effect. The prospect of EU membership is, I think, at the end of the day, still a carrot. A positive benefit that can be used to negotiate with these countries that are having accession talks, that may play a role with Serbia, that may play a role with some of the smaller Balkan countries, for which EU membership is still very important. But Turkey remains sort of on the sidelines in the sense that it's a huge country, so it can have alternatives to European Union. If it were to join European Union, it's going to become the most populous country within EU with 85 million people. And so that's not a very realistic prospect. Both sides know it, which is why I think Turkey would be a very difficult case, which is why at this point, what EU needs to do is to take the Turkish political opposition seriously, is to not treat Erdogan as the only face of Turkey, to realize that the opposition actually represents probably majority of the electorate. And so while pragmatically dealing with Erdogan, they should also do whatever they can to empower the opposition and at the very least publicize what the political opposition in Turkey is doing. And maybe bring that to the attention of Erdogan so that he's not given a free hand. But beyond that, I think it's going to be left to domestic actors to deal with this question.
Well, thank you. Perhaps you can end by telling our listeners a little bit more about your current research, and we'll make sure to link to your websites and any research you would like to highlight in the podcast description. So any listeners, you can follow Berk's work there, reach out.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Emily. I'm really glad to be here, and I think these were excellent questions that actually helped me think about my own research in a rather more policy relevant manner, because lately I've been working on autocratization processes, particularly in Turkey, but also in other countries that are similar to Turkey, in Eastern Europe and beyond. And lately I've been working on opposition coordination that occurs in these electoral authoritarian contexts. So how do opposition parties come together, under what conditions they can establish an pre-electoral alliance, what factors enable them to win or lose the election. So these are really some of the questions that I address in my research.
Thank you so much, Berk. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And listeners, tell us what you think. You can find all the information mentioned in today's episode in the podcast description, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and across our social media as well. We would really value your feedback. Thank you very much for listening.